And so once we, I don't know, James, are we live on Facebook?
Just about.
Okay. I'll see it pop up and then I'll go ahead and introduce Ali. What's up, everyone? Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the campaign manager for the Smart Justice campaign here in Wisconsin for the ACLU of Wisconsin. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, we're going to have a conversation about revocations. Here in the state of Wisconsin, we call it crimeless revocation. Many folks know it as technical rules-only revocations. And so we're going to have a conversation tonight about the impact of revocations on mass incarceration. And we're joined tonight by Allison Frankel, Nair Fellow for Human Rights Watch, and the author of this report. And so she's going to give us a presentation on Revoked. Many of our viewers, I'm sure, remember Ali from a year ago when she came and investigated and researched. So a lot of the things that you all are going to hear and see tonight, it's going to be familiar because, you've lived it and you heard and seen these stories. But so I'm going to pass it off to Ali to give our presentations. If you have any questions, please post them in the Facebook chat. Place them in the Q&A on the Zoom, and we will try to get to those questions at the end of her presentation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sean, for having me, and to the ACLU of Wisconsin for putting this all together, and for all of your help throughout this research and writing process. It's really been an awesome collaboration opportunity. And to all of you joining us, thank you, especially those of you who were kind enough to share your stories with us during our research and help inform our recommendations. So thank you. So probation and parole, as Sean just said, these things, they're talked about as alternatives to incarceration that'll help people get back on their feet. But in reality, what we found is they're driving high numbers of people, particularly Black and brown people, right back to jail and prison, while in large part failing to connect them with the resources and services that they need. We spent the last year documenting the tripwires that are leading so many people in the US from their supervision back to incarceration, with a focus on 3 states where our initial research suggested this problem is particularly bad: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. We went around the country, interviewed 164 people, watched court proceedings, and analyzed data. And so I'm just going to go through some of our findings, and then I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you all. So while supervision is promoted as this lenient gift, its reality is harsh and punitive and oppressive. Over the last 4 decades, probation and parole populations have skyrocketed right alongside jail and prison growth. As of 2016, there were 2.2 million people in US jails and prisons, but 4.5 million, or every 1 in 55 people in the US, were on supervision. In Wisconsin, that number is 1 in 69, or 66,400 people under correctional control from probation or parole right now. These people are required to follow a maze of wide-ranging, vague, and hard-to-follow conditions. Wisconsin requires everyone on supervision to follow 18 rules, just as a starting point, on top of numerous discretionary conditions. We talked to one man in Milwaukee, Ernest Burgess, who had to comply with 39 rules just for a drug conviction. These include things like attending frequent meetings, maintaining full-time employment, staying away from any establishment whose main source of income is alcohol. Many of these rules are nearly impossible to follow without access to resources like jobs, housing, and health services, but supervision is in large part failing to connect people with them. And of course, there are massive racial disparities here nationwide, and particularly in Wisconsin. Structural racism means that Black and brown people are more likely to be under supervision, but less likely to have those resources necessary to successfully navigate it. Nationwide, 1 in every 81 white people are on supervision, but for Black people, that number is 1 in 23. In Wisconsin in 2017, 1 in 8 Black men were on supervision, more than 5 times the rate for white men. For Native Americans, it was 1 in 11, 4 times the rate for white men. Our research showed that in the states we examined, people are often locked up just for breaking a rule of their supervision, which otherwise wouldn't be against the law, what Sean called a crimeless revocation, or for low-level offenses. In Wisconsin here, the data from the Department of Corrections showed that when people are locked up for rule violations, it's often for using drugs, consuming alcohol or going into a bar, or breaking a rule of a supervision-mandated treatment program. When it was for an alleged new offense, it was most often public order offenses like disorderly conduct, misdemeanor assaultive conduct, drug possession, or shoplifting. Now, to be clear, the system is not just unfair for these people. It is unfair for everyone, even those charged with serious misconduct, who face longer detention pending proceedings that don't protect their rights, as I'll talk about now. So once you're accused of violating your supervision, you face significant periods of incarceration, even if your supervision never ends up getting revoked. In Wisconsin, supervision officers regularly file these things called holds, which allow you to be detained for up to 15 business days, just while they're considering whether to file a revocation petition, and before your access to counsel is triggered. In many places we studied, including parts of Wisconsin, people, once revocation petitions are filed, regularly sit in jail for months, just waiting for a hearing to challenge the allegations. This happens even for rule violations, and even if there's no demonstrable evidence someone poses a risk of fleeing. In Milwaukee, wait times can be 30 to 45 days before a hearing. In Dodge County, it can be 60 to 90 days. And many people spend this time in jails that are overcrowded, that are unsanitary, that lack adequate mental health services, and that are at high risk of extreme outbreaks of COVID-19. Facilities like the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility, or MSDF, featured here. We found that this places immense pressure on people to admit to the allegations just to get out of jail. In Wisconsin, a lot of people plead to these alternative to revocation programs, but those programs are often based in prisons like MSDF, where they've just been detained. And of course, violating any rule of these alternative to revocation programs is itself grounds for revocation. And we documented multiple instances of people pleading to an alternative only to end up revoked for violating those rules. So as you can tell from that last slide, probation and parole are just operating under a totally different legal system, one where your basic rights, from the presumption of innocence to speedy detention hearings to the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, just go out the window. And in Wisconsin, supervision officers actually require people accused of violating their supervision to give a statement in jail without access to attorney. Failing to give a statement is itself a separate grounds for revocation, but admitting to any violation, no matter how small, automatically waives basic rights, such as your right to an initial preliminary revocation hearing. And following these proceedings, people face harsh punishments, including more supervision, prison-based treatment programs, which can keep you, as I said, on the hook for further incarceration for any slip-up, or additional jail and prison time. So rather than diverting people from confinement, which is what probation and parole were designed to do and what they purport to do, they're feeding mass incarceration. In 2017, nearly half of people who entered America's state prisons were sent there for supervision violations. In Wisconsin, it was 70%. Over the last 2 decades, Wisconsin has consistently admitted about twice as many people to prison for revocations as for regular criminal convictions. And these figures don't even include the number of people who are sitting in jails for which there's little national data. So the true scope of this problem is even higher. And most of these people nationwide were not convicted of a new crime. Here in Wisconsin, from 2017 to 2019, our data analysis showed that half of all violations that resulted in incarceration were just for rule violations, without any allegation of conduct that would even constitute a crime. And over the last 2 decades, revocations without a new conviction have been the single largest category of prison admissions in the state of Wisconsin. And as I discussed earlier, even those who are accused of or convicted of serious offenses face massive deprivations of their fair trial rights and disproportionate punishment under these probation and parole schemes. All of this is further exacerbating the already stark racial disparities across the country and in Wisconsin. Multiple studies show that Black people are disproportionately stopped, searched, and arrested, which can easily lead to violations. And they're more likely to have their supervision revoked than similarly situated white people. For instance, in Milwaukee, Black people make up 26% of the population, but 64% of those under supervision and 78% of those admitted to prison following revocations. And when, through our research, we looked at, what's at the bottom driving all of this, we found that, unsurprisingly, violations often stem from poverty and a lack of resources. When folks don't have enough money to pay their supervision mandated costs, many stop showing up, leading to violations for failure to report. People who don't have housing stability often struggle to report every time they move from a park bench to an abandoned car to somewhere else where they're staying. Drug use, whether casually or due to a substance use disorder, frequently leads to violations. And mental health conditions can heighten the already high barriers to navigating these complex, wide-ranging rules. Racially biased policing also plays a massive role here. In Milwaukee, for instance, vehicle and pedestrian stop rates for Black people are 5 times what they are for white people, putting Black people at higher risk of getting their supervision violated. Ultimately, what we found is that in locking people up for failing to meet the overly burdensome rules of their supervision is a grossly disproportionate response that further upends people's lives without meaningfully addressing their underlying needs. And these findings implicate a lot of US and international human rights laws. I won't delve into all of them, but things like disproportionate punishment, discrimination based on race, wealth, and disability, arbitrary detention, vagueness, fair trial violations, violations of the right to an adequate standard of living, and of the right to health. So where do we go from here? Our report lays out detailed recommendations to local, state, and federal officials, but there are 3 key things that we think will substantially reduce the burdens of supervision and help people get what they need. So first and foremost, we need to divest from supervision and incarceration and invest in increasing access to things like jobs, housing, voluntary community-based substance use disorder, and mental health services. Second, we need to just stop sentencing so many people to supervision and instead use real alternatives to incarceration, like unconditional discharges or proportionate and flexible community service requirements. And then when supervision is imposed, we need to dramatically shorten the lengths of supervision sentences, reduce the number and types of conditions imposed, and strictly limit the government's ability to lock people up for alleged violations, both before and after revocation proceedings. We think these changes will go a long way towards breaking this supervision to incarceration pipeline and helping people get the resources that they want and need. So that's my very quick rundown of a really long report. I'd love to answer all of your questions. My contact information is here, so you can feel free to follow up with me afterwards, but I hope you'll ask questions during tonight's talk. Thanks so much again.
Thank you, Allison. Great presentation, powerful presentation. And I think for our audience and a lot of folks who, have been working on criminal legal reform here in the state of Wisconsin, it's clear that we have a problem of reincarcerating folks after incarceration, a problem that has a human impact. in a financial impact. And I think the recommendations that you made will drastically reduce that number significantly, because most of the folks who are returning to prison are because, as you stated in your presentation, is a result of unstable housing, poverty, et cetera. And so oftentimes in these conversations around criminal legal reform, women tend to get lost in the conversation. And I don't think it's intentional that women get lost in the conversation, but one of our questions that we have from my colleague, Melissa Luden, she asks, Wisconsin's women's prison population is around 1,400. How many of these women are there for supervision violation?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, for the good question. And that's completely right, that women are a huge facet of increasing jail and prison admissions in the country right now, even as admissions in many places are overall declining. I don't have that number right now, but I will definitely look into it and get back to all of you with it, because it's a really, really crucial point.
Thank you. And we have another question from one of the attendees who asks if you can repeat the positive alternatives again on your slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of positive alternatives to supervision sentences, things like an unconditional discharge, which is basically you went through the incredibly onerous process of being arrested, charged, going through the court system. You have a conviction, which we know carries serious collateral consequences for housing, benefits, ability to vote, of course, all things that should be changed, but that scar people now nonetheless, and that itself is sufficient punishment for many offenses. Another idea we've been throwing around is a system of proportionate and flexible community service. And those two first words are really key here, because community supervision, if you're working multiple jobs and caring for people, or sorry, not community supervision, community service, if you're working multiple jobs and caring for dependents is not necessarily something you have time for. So making it flexible with people's schedules and ideally actually giving them skills that they need could be another helpful alternative to just going for probation, which is, again, just a tripwire back to incarceration.
Thank you. Ali, I know that you interviewed a lot of people, and that's what I love about this report is that you made sure that you spoke with impacted folks. You made sure that you spoke with elected officials, system actors. You covered the spectrum, and I think that's very important in order for us to come to a viable solution to the problem of mass incarceration here in the state of Wisconsin. And I think I already know what many impacted folks have said, and I have an idea of what some of the system actors have said as well, because I'm speaking with them and educating them on this issue of crimeless or technical rules only revocations. But what did you hear from Probation and Parole or the DOC during your research of this report?
Yeah, great question. So a lot of the people that we talked to really did seem to recognize that we have way too many people on supervision. Caseloads are enormously high, which isn't helpful for people on supervision or those who are supervising them, and that a lot of people are getting locked up for things that they shouldn't necessarily be incarcerated for. So there does seem to be a lot of agreement. One of the big areas where I found just some really interesting disagreements in Wisconsin and across the country was on drug offenses. So I would talk to a lot of people who would say, look, we don't like to lock up people just because they have an addiction. We give them multiple chances. We give them programs. But then what I'd ask, okay, well, what happens if they do use, if they have a dirty urine? And eventually it always came to like, well, then we have to lock them up. And there's just this total disconnect. Either using drugs is a health issue, drug addiction is a health issue, which we say it is, or it's not. And they seem to kind of treat it as a health issue to an extent, but if they get so frustrated that your substance use disorder is so severe that you are going to test positive, as relapse is a part of recovery, then they think they need to lock you up. And I also heard from a number of people, it's unfortunate, but we either lock them up in jail or they die on the street. But if you talk to addiction experts, as we did for this report, they'll tell you that jail is not the solution for someone who has a substance use disorder. It only makes it worse. very few people incarcerated actually get treatment for their addictions. Many end up overdosing when they're out because their tolerance has gone down, and the trauma of incarceration can make people want to use even more. So I think that there's a lot of good room here for conversations with many supervision departments who do understand that things aren't working the way that they're supposed to. But we just need to be having those deeper conversations to really show why so many of the things that we're doing are not just harmful, but also incredibly counterproductive.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have another question related to the governor. I know that in the report there are recommendations for state officials and state legislators. So one of the question that I have is, what can the governor, are there current executive orders the governor can do to reduce the prison population? That is a question that we're getting off Facebook. So if you want to speak to some of the recommendations that you mentioned in your report.
Yeah, absolutely. And a shout out to many people at Expo and other organizations who helped us to formulate these specific recommendations, because there's some really great and creative work happening now with advocacy to the governor. So two of the things we're recommending in this space is, one, governors have this power to commute sentences. I think there's actually another ACLU event going on right now about the power of commutations, and it's something we all need to be talking about more. The governor can commute the sentence of people who are unfairly incarcerated. As an example, people who are locked up for these crimeless revocations, or even for new charges for things like simple drug possession that we don't think should be criminalized to begin with. He has the power to just commute those people's sentences, get them out of incarceration, and also to commute their supervision terms. So that's one of the things that we're really supporting, is getting people out of prison who are there for these unfair reasons, and presumptively commuting probation and parole terms of people who've served, say, more than a couple months. Because research shows that anything more than a few months or a year or two on supervision has vastly diminishing returns.
Absolutely. And I echo your shout out to, our coalition partners, ExpoX Incarcerated People Organizing, who are on the front line with the ACLU and our decarceration efforts. And we've all met with the governor's staff, and that is one of the things that we're urging him to do, is to put forth an executive order to end the practice of sending folks back to prison for rules only violation. And the ACLU, as you had just mentioned, we are our national, the national ACLU is having a town hall currently talking about clemency. And we're going to be releasing a press release where we're asking the governor to commute the sentences of individuals who are within 6 to 12 months of being released. And many of these individuals are individuals who are serving time for crimeless revocation. And they are, in fact, crimeless revocation. They have not committed a new crime. They violated a rule of supervision. I'm certain that the average American, when they hear that someone is incarcerated, the first thought that they have is, this person committed a crime. Not that this person broke a rule that is of no consequence if these rules were applicable to the average American. So we have a problem in this country, and we have a problem here in the state of Wisconsin in sending up to 3,000 people back to prison each year. And that's why this report is very pertinent. And I encourage you all to read it, share it, and make those calls to the governor, demand of your elected officials and your and the policy folks to put forth the plan that's going to end this practice. And so, moving on to another question that we just received from Lisa, what would it take to change this system? And you have some great recommendations that you mentioned at the end of your report. So could you speak a little bit more about the what it would take to change this?
Yeah. So in some sense, it's overwhelming because there's so much that's going wrong, but there's also a lot of levers that we can pull on to create really meaningful change. So starting from supervision departments, we can advocate with them to just make internal policy choices that would make things a whole lot better for people who are on supervision right now. This would include stop issuing holds and just detaining people unless there's actually demonstrable evidence that they pose some high-level risk of fleeing. encouraging them not to pursue revocation just for rule violations or even new offense violations that don't raise serious safety concerns and things like that. We can also be advocating with local police departments to stop arresting people for so many of the low-level offenses that end up getting people trapped in the supervision system to begin with. Things, again, like simple drug possession that don't need to be dealt with through law enforcement. And with prosecutors to stop bringing charges in those types of cases and instead using restorative justice mechanisms or other alternative dispute mechanisms in those cases. And then going up the chain further, talking to state lawmakers. I know legislative change is really tough in Wisconsin right now, but there were some good bills put forward last session. So working on more legislation like that, that would not allow people to get locked up just for rule violations. We could have legislation to reduce the number of standard conditions. There's 18 standard rules right now. There's no reason that everyone needs to follow these same 18 rules. And to reduce the lengths of supervision sentences, which are totally out of step. Extended supervision in Wisconsin is nearly twice as long as the national average for parole type sentences. Also advocating with local governments to work to shift money into community-based resources, capturing the savings that we'll have from stopping locking so many people up just for these rule violations. So there's a lot of different people that have power in this system, and we need to be advocating for all of them to do their part to stop keeping people in this oppressive cycle of supervision and incarceration.
Thank you. Ali, we have a question from one of our viewers who asked, how did we get here?
Great question. Great question. So supervision started as this thing in the 19th century that was supposed to help people. The United States was all about rehabilitation back then. And there was this idea there would be someone, it was a community member, a friend that would kind of help you out, get you on the right track. And it was totally paternalistic, but it wasn't punitive in the way that it is now. And then it became enormously popular as a sentence in the ensuing decades. But basically, this rehabilitative supervision program just slammed head on with this 1970s Nixon era tough on crime movement and the war on drugs. And it just has never been the same since. The amount of people on supervision grew enormously. The number of conditions imposed skyrocketed. The lengths of sentences increased. A huge thing that happened is, so if you read reports of like the early founders of probation and parole, it's all about sparing people from the horrors of jail and prison. But then in the 70s and 80s, instead of giving people probation or parole instead of prison, they started giving it in addition to prison. So things like extended supervision in Wisconsin, where you're serving your whole prison term and then a period of supervision after that. So that's become really problematic. And we see the change too in the people who are enforcing these rules. Again, they used to be friends, community members, not people running around with guns and going into your house without a warrant. But that's what they've come into, these community corrections officers that have a gun and a badge and all of these powers to stop, search, and seize you from the streets. So we need to really be going back to its rehabilitative roots, not what it is now.
Okay. We just got another question in that said that elected officials are resistant to make appropriate decisions on sentencing that include probation and parole in fear of not being reelected. What are your thoughts on how to address this?
Yeah, it's a huge problem and gets to an enormous problem of having elected judges. I mean, you see it all around, right? People like campaigning on being tough on crime in other states of imposing the death penalty in order to get reelected. And it's a massive issue. I mean, nobody so far has gotten hurt by being too tough on crime, although I do think that that's starting to change, even just within the past couple of months. And I hope that we can really build on the momentum of the current uprising and protest movements, and, you know, start saying that just locking people up and brutalizing people, particularly communities of color this way, is not something that we're okay with as a society. And it's not something that you can campaign on. And so I hope that we'll be able to actually change that. That said, I think that it's a difficult thing to do. I think other things that we can explain are just, you know, if you look at the data, supervision terms of more than 1 to 2 years have such diminishing returns. The vast majority of actual crimes are committed within that period. After that, you're just going to catch someone who misses a meeting or does some other rule violation that poses no public safety concerns. So I think there's a lot of just data on the fact that this regime is not protecting public safety that can be compelling to those types of people. Also, as you said, it's enormously expensive. And I think that can help as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. And to add on to that, I also think that we must hold our elected officials accountable. That's something that, the ACLU has been doing since we launched the Smart Justice campaign here in Wisconsin. Is engaging elected officials and educating them on the cost of crimeless revocation, educating them on what this actually is, bringing our volunteers into these spaces so that they can share their story, because we do believe that those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so they need to hear the stories of how you, your loved one, a neighbor have been impacted by the system of probation and parole in order for them to want to be inclined to do something. Oftentimes during the election cycle, we hear politicians get up there and they share a story about a mother or a son who is experiencing a hardship because they lost their job, because their job was sent overseas. They never share the story of how how a mother's son was sent back to prison because he violated a rule of supervision by being late to an appointment, or by having a dirty urinalysis. You never hear those stories out of the mouths of politicians. So we're calling on, our viewers, we're calling on our volunteers to continue to share these stories to these elected officials who are out there running for office, who are new candidates and who are incumbents. We want you to share your story on how you've been impacted by this, so that they know that you're watching how they're going to operate once they get to Madison. There's a lot of partisanship in Madison, but in order for us to change that, we have to hold them accountable. All 99 seats are up for re-election in the assembly. And many of these individuals are holding virtual town halls. Many of these individuals are sending you emails and postcards. We're asking you to hold them accountable and ask them the hard questions. That is what can be done. In addition to that, we're also asking folks to email the governor, call the governor and ask the governor, what is he doing? How is he moving? How is he moving the goal that he set during the campaign to reduce our prison population, to reform our criminal legal system? Ask him, what is the progress? And not only ask him what is the progress, but let him know what grade you're giving him at this moment, because as an educator who is not educated on this, and it's our responsibility as citizens and advocates to educate the governor on this issue so that he knows what to do and he knows that we're going to hold him accountable. So let me hop off my soapbox. And so another question came in, Ali, and it is, what can or has been done to address PO holds not being able to be lifted by anyone but a probation officer? This is a major problem.
It is a major, major problem. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, once a probation or parole officer issues a hold that allows you to be locked up in jail, that overrules any other detention determination. So say you're accused of a new crime like shoplifting, and that also violates your supervision. You might be eligible for release, whether it's just released or a bail that you're somehow able to afford on that shoplifting charge. But if your PO filed a hold, you're stuck, even if you would otherwise be able to be out. And of course, for people who are stuck on holds for things that don't even constitute crimes, there's just no chance of getting out. So it's a massive problem. I also saw this come up a lot in cases amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, when people were working in the government to try to get people out of jail in the beginning, but some people were just stuck there because of these holds and detainers, as they're called in other cases. I don't know of any changes to fix this, but it's one of the biggest things that we need to do. And we have a lot of recommendations in our report that both supervision departments can do and the legislature can do to limit the power. Because in some states, supervision officers can just file these holds with barely any authority from a judge or anyone else. And in other places, when you do have to go to a judge, it's essentially a rubber stamp. And people would say, like, yeah, I've had a couple denied in a couple of years, but pretty much if we file it, they trust that it's worthwhile, even though in many cases, the charges are incredibly minor. And in any event, there's no evidence someone poses a risk of flight. So it's a really big problem we need to all be working on.
Thank you. We just got a question that asks, and you had mentioned early on in your presentation and also in response to a question, you know, when you came to Wisconsin and interviewed folks, you also interviewed system actors and folks within probation and parole and the DOC. So the question that folks are asking is, with the alternatives presented, what are the steps being taken to try to make change?
Yeah, great question. So I think that there is movement happening in Milwaukee and elsewhere in Wisconsin. I know there's a community justice council that's been working with the MacArthur Safety and Justice Initiative on reducing jail populations. And through that work, as well as just through releases during COVID-19, jail populations really have been going down in the last couple of months. We hope this is a trend that stays beyond the pandemic, because this has always been a crisis. COVID is just making it worse. But we do see, for instance, the Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility had over 1,000 people in January. But as of the last time numbers were reported on July 31st, it was, I think, 591. So we really do see those numbers coming down. And of course, MSDF is this thing created for people on supervision. So that has a direct relation to the number of people on supervision who are locked up. So those changes are really promising. But we're really looking forward, now that this report is out there and given all the work that's being done by you all, so many on this call, to working with leaders in Wisconsin and elsewhere to really try to implement these changes for the long term.
Thank you. We have a question from Lisa Hanneman. She asks, or she states, I am part of circles of support here in Neenah. I have known some of our members having up to 40 rules they must abide by. That seems very unreasonable. Also, having to live by these rules makes for even a more stressful life. Can you talk about if there were anyone that you met with and spoke with who had those types of rules or that amount?
Totally. So many people. So one man I mentioned briefly earlier, Ernest Burgess, we met in Milwaukee, had 39 rules for a drug conviction. And he said, you know, what are you doing? Are you trying to rehabilitate me, or are you just trying to punish me? Because I don't really see the point of what this is doing, he said. I talked to lots of people, particularly a lot of Black men in cities like Milwaukee and Philadelphia, who had rules requiring them to stay away from anyone with a felony, or sometimes they'd have vague rules like staying away from disreputable people. And, you know, the stats on how many people in the United States, and particularly how many Black men have criminal convictions, are just staggering. I think it's 1 in 3 Black men have a felony conviction, and that's just felonies. And so entire communities are basically blocked from being able to communicate with each other. I talked to one guy in Philadelphia who was saying, you know, I feel like I can't even get in a car with someone or go down the block because I don't know if that guy has a record. Like, everyone in my community has a record because the police are always here. And so this is a really big problem. We would talk to so many people that had just immense anxiety and trauma just from being under supervision and having to live every single day not knowing whether they'd come home at night. One guy told me that he just wakes up in sweats because he has nightmares that he's being chased by his PO. So it's a really, really enormous and devastating problem.
Wow, that's powerful. And I think that that's what I really want folks to understand as we're talking about, you know, the issue of excessive supervisions and how it feeds mass incarceration. And just, you know, even though we have all of this data that says this amount of people are sent back to prison because they were revoked, I want folks to really think about the psychology of individuals who are on probation and parole and how they're literally walking around on eggshells, knowing that they can be sent back to prison, their life can be upturned with a drop of the hat, you know. So I want folks to really understand that the psychological impact that this has on the individual, as well as the impact that it has on families as well as communities. And so that is all the more reason for folks to be involved, for folks to be concerned, and for folks to be calling out their elected officials and calling out the governor on the need to end this practice. And as I mentioned earlier, we're asking the governor, and this is, we're asking the governor to issue an executive order. And this is a temporary fix. This is something that will exist as long as he's in office. But in addition to us asking the governor to issue an executive order, ending the practice of crimeless revocation, we're also engaging the legislature to pass legislation to end this practice. Because we know that if legislation is passed, we know that this is something that is more sustainable. And in order to undo it, new legislation has to be introduced. So those are two paths that the ACLU and our coalition partners are pushing to end this practice. And we're not able to do this alone. We need the support of community members. We need the support of impacted people. And so if you want to get involved, if you want to know how you can end this practice, shoot me an email. You can connect with me via Facebook. You can connect with me by sending me an email. If you want more information, you can shoot Allie an email as well. Many folks are aware of the Expo, Wisdom. These are all our coalition partners. We're all working on this. And so that is what you can do, to help. That's what you can do to end this practice. And so we're coming up on the closing hours. And there is a few more questions before we close out. And I'll ask that question at the end. But someone asked, how can we end excessive supervisions, Allie? Could you speak to what the report recommended as it relates? I know you spoke to it briefly early on, but could you just mention like the concrete things that are like viable that can be done like right now to end the practice of excessive supervisions?
Totally. And it's a really important point that continues to bear talking about. So the best way to end this is through an exercise of discretion at the front end of the system. So one, just stop. Part of the problem with excessive supervision, there's kind of two things here. One, we're imposing it for cases that should not be getting supervision, that should either just not be being prosecuted or be dealt with through far less punitive means. And two, the lengths are far too long. So on the one hand, we need to be urging police officers and prosecutors to just stop arresting people and stop charging people for these really low-level offenses that should not be getting supervision, because supervision is not an alternative to incarceration, it's delayed incarceration. And when cases are charged, prosecutors should not be seeking probation in really low-level cases. Unless you think that something could deserve incarceration, you shouldn't be giving them probation, because that's probably where they'll end up. And they should be using real alternatives like restorative justice mechanisms, unconditional discharges, proportionate, flexible community service. And then to address the lengths of supervision sentences, again, prosecutors have discretion here to not seek such excessive terms. I mean, you see many cases where people are getting terms of extended supervision that are as long as the amount of time they're serving in prison, right? 5 years in prison, 5 years of extended supervision, 10 and 10. When we could be reducing that dramatically just to 25%, the minimum under the law. So those are some severe changes. Judges, advocacy with them as well to not be imposing supervision in cases where it would be excessive. And then also with the legislature to just use their power to just end the practice of extended supervision. We don't need it. People have served their time. They can get out early on parole. We need to get rid of truth in sentencing and to reduce the allowable terms for probation.
Thank you, Allie. We have one final question. This is a good question. I'll ask. Well, let's make it two more questions. But what is your opinion on state sentences for individuals who are on probation and parole?
Unstayed sentences?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for anyone who's not familiar, there's basically two ways that you can get sentenced when you're on probation in Wisconsin. They can either, one, impose and stay a sentence. So when they're sentencing you for the crime, they can give you probation and say, okay, we're staying a 2-year, 5-year, 10-year probation term. And then if you get violated, you don't get a new sentencing hearing. You just have to serve that entire amount of time, regardless of whether it's excessive for the violation that triggered your revocation. The other option would be for them to withhold sentence, so they don't give you a sentence. And then if you get revoked, you go back for a sentencing hearing and can get anything up to the maximum for the original offense. I really have heard such differing things from people that I interviewed, practitioners in the field, on what's better in terms of this. On the one hand, I think they can really lead to excessive sentencing. You know, I watched a revocation proceeding in MSDF for this guy who had a 5-year stayed sentence, and the administrative law judge and everyone in the room was pretty clear that the allegation had probably been proven beyond the incredibly low preponderance of the evidence standard. But that 5 years was totally excessive for the alleged conduct. And this judge was kind of caught in this web of either he doesn't violate him, even though he thinks this guy violated his conditions, or he imposes this sentence that might be too severe. And he, mentioned, like, I wish this was a case where I had discretion. And he ended up revoking the guy, and now he's serving 5 years in prison. So I think stayed sentences raise serious, serious concerns with that. The only thing I'll just flag on the other end is that, going in for sentencing up to the maximum allowable sentence for these offenses, which can be really high in Wisconsin, after you've been revoked, is like not a great posture to go into a sentencing proceeding. And I think there's also a big concern that when sentence is withheld, you could get hit with something pretty hard because they could kind of punish you for the revocation. So I think both can be really problematic, which gets to another point of we need to lower the maximum range for so many of these sentences and stop revoking people for conduct that doesn't raise serious safety concerns.
Okay, last question, and I think you opened up a can of worms with your last response, but the question is, what can we do about administrative law judges who wants to sentence folks harshly every time?
Yeah, it's a huge problem. ALJs operate in this really opaque world. It was really hard for me to get in to even see any hearings for my research. There's no public oversight. Most people don't know who these people are making these decisions. I would love to hear from you all on ideas of what we can do to stop getting them to sentence folks so harshly. I think public education is a huge thing. I think a lot of them don't realize, a lot of judges in general, right? They give someone 1-2 years and they think, oh, that's low, because sentences in America are so absurdly high that is comparably low for some people. But that can completely disrupt someone's life, and getting them to hear stories that we heard in the report that so many of you have lived yourselves, I think could go a long way. But I'd love to chat more about ways that we could do some advocacy on that front.
Thank you, Allison. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. You just heard from Allison Franco, Nair Fellow at Human Rights Watch, and author of the report Revoked that was just released last week. I encourage everyone to read this report. It is very in-depth. It is informed by impacted people and system actors. The recommendations within this report are great. It is in the line with the recommendations that the ACLU is advocating for, as well as our coalition partners. So I urge you all to read this report, to get in contact with Allie for further questions. You all can shoot her email. You want to say your email?
Yeah, here, I'll put it in the chat for those of you who are on Zoom, and it's frankea@hrw.org. So almost my last name of Frankel, but with an A at the end, at hrw.org.
And then my colleague, James, will share your email on Facebook for our viewers on Facebook. Again, thank you, Allison, for coming on, joining us. Powerful. Congratulations on the report. We appreciate you. Continue to do, good work. Thank you to our viewers. Please join us next week for a Know Your Rights training for demonstrators' rights being given by my colleague and youth organizer, Hope Owens Wilson. That concludes tonight's town hall. Continue to follow us on all of our social media platforms. Become a member of the ACLU. I encourage you. There are a lot of perks. Stay informed. We're going to continue to work to end mass incarceration here in the state of Wisconsin. As you know, our slogan is people, not prison. Invest in people and divest from prisons. And have a great rest of your night. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean.
Thank you, Alex.